They ordered humanity to abandon Earth. The human fleet turned around and asked one question. The message came on a quiet Tuesday morning, and it changed everything. It did not arrive as a bomb or a fleet of warships. It arrived as a single small courier vessel, sleek and silver, dropping out of hyperspace near the edge of the solar system. The ship carried no weapons. It carried only a message, sealed with the mark of the Galactic Assembly, the loose council of species that governed the trade lanes and border treaties of this part of the galaxy. Humanity had joined the Assembly 40 years earlier, after decades of careful, slow contact with other species. In that time, humans had built colonies on Mars, on the moons of Jupiter, and on a handful of worlds several light years from Earth. They had grown used to being the newest, smallest member of a much older community. They had learned to be patient. They had learned to listen. But the message on that Tuesday morning was not a request. It was an order. Admiral Elena Reyes read it twice before she believed it. She was 52 years old, with short gray hair and eyes that had seen 3 wars and countless negotiations. She sat in the command chair of the Earth Defense Fleet's flagship, the Meridian, orbiting high above the Pacific Ocean. The message glowed on the screen in front of her, translated from the Assembly's formal trade language into plain English. By order of the Galactic Assembly, the system designated Sol and the planet designated Earth must be evacuated within 90 standard days. The reason given was classified under Assembly Security Protocol. All member species were required to comply with evacuation orders issued for safety reasons. Failure to comply would result in the loss of Assembly protection and trade rights for the human species. Reyes read the words again. 90 days. Evacuate an entire planet, home to 9 billion people, in 90 days. Whoa, get me the council, she said quietly. Within an hour, the leaders of Earth's nations were connected through a secure channel, along with the human representative to the Galactic Assembly, a calm, careful diplomat named Marcus Webb. Webb had spent 15 years building relationships between humanity and the wider galaxy. His face, projected on the screen, looked pale and tired. They won't tell us why, Webb said. I have asked. I have demanded. The Assembly Council says the reason is classified for our own protection. They say if we are told the reason, it could put other systems at risk. That is not an answer, said the president of the North American Union, a sharp-eyed woman named Aisha Okafor. That is a wall. I know, Webb said, but they are not asking us to negotiate. They are telling us to leave. The room was silent for a long moment. On Earth, ordinary life continued outside the windows of 100 government buildings. People walking to work, children playing in parks, ships loading cargo in busy ports. None of them yet knew that their entire way of life was about to be uprooted. What happens if we refuse? Asked the Prime Minister of the European Federation. Webb's expression darkened. The Assembly does not use force against member species directly, but if we refuse, we lose our membership. No more trade, no more access to Assembly technology, medicine, or star charts. We would be alone, and we would be marked as a rogue species. Some of the more aggressive powers outside the Assembly's protection have attacked isolated worlds before. Without Assembly protection, Earth would be vulnerable to raiders, pirates, and worse. So it is not truly a request, Reyes said. It is a threat wrapped in polite language. Yes, Webb admitted. That is exactly what it is. For 3 days, the leaders of Earth argued. Some wanted to refuse outright and defend the planet with the fleet they had built over the past 2 decades. Others pointed out that Earth's fleet, while strong for a young species, was still far weaker than the combined might of older Assembly members. A war against the Assembly, even a defensive one, could mean the end of humanity entirely. In the end, cooler heads prevailed, not because anyone wanted to leave, but because nobody wanted to gamble the survival of the species on a fight they could not win, without knowing why they were fighting. The Council voted, narrowly, to comply. Humanity would build an evacuation fleet. Humanity would leave Earth. The decision broke something in almost everyone who heard it. Admiral Reyes was given command of what came to be called the Exodus Fleet, a massive effort to evacuate as many people as possible before the 90-day deadline. Every shipyard on Earth and its colonies began working around the clock. Cargo haulers were converted into passenger ships. New vessels were built at a pace no one thought possible. Families were told they could bring only what fit in a single storage container. Pets, in most cases, could not come. Homes were left with the lights still on, the furniture still in place, as if their owners might return from a long trip. In the city of Manila, a young engineer named Diego Santos said goodbye to the small apartment where he had grown up. He took one photograph of his grandmother's kitchen before he closed the door for the last time. He did not know, standing in that hallway, that within a year, he would become one of the most important people in the entire fleet. In Nairobi, a school teacher named Amara Chukwu gathered her students for their final class on Earth. She told them a story about a bird that had to leave its nest, but always remembered how to find its way home. She did not fully believe the story herself, but she needed her students to believe it. Across the planet, this scene repeated itself, in 1,000 different languages, in 1,000,000 different homes. Grief moved through humanity like a slow tide, rising every day, as the deadline grew closer. Reyes did not have time for grief. She had a fleet to build, and a species to save. She worked 18-hour days, coordinating shipyards, negotiating cargo space, and settling disputes between nations about who would get priority evacuation slots. She barely slept. She barely ate. She held the weight of 9 billion lives on her shoulders, and she carried it because someone had to. On the 60th day, something strange happened. A young lieutenant named Priya Nair, working in the fleet's intelligence division, brought Reyes a data file with a troubled look on her face. "Admiral, I think you need to see this," Priya said. The file contained records pulled from assembly trade logs, the kind of routine shipping data that Earth's diplomats had access to as part of normal trade monitoring. Priya had been cross-referencing evacuation orders issued by the assembly over the past 50 years, out of simple curiosity, trying to understand how such orders normally worked. She found only 3 other cases in 50 years where the assembly had ordered a full planetary evacuation. In each case, the reason given afterward, once the evacuation was complete, involved a natural disaster, an unstable star, an incoming asteroid cluster, a plague outbreak that could not be contained. But there was something different about this case. In all 3 previous evacuations, assembly ships had remained in orbit around the evacuated planet after the evacuation was complete, monitoring the situation, sometimes for years. In this case, the assembly's evacuation order for Earth included a strange clause. Once the evacuation was complete, the entire Sol system would be marked as a restricted zone, off-limits to all ships, including assembly vessels, for an unspecified period of time. Why would they want no one to go there? Priya asked. If it was a real disaster, wouldn't they want ships nearby to study it, to help contain it, to make sure it doesn't spread? Reyes stared at the data for a long time. "Unless there is nothing to contain," she said slowly. "Unless the danger they are protecting us from is not a danger to Earth at all." "Then what is it?" Priya asked. "I don't know," Reyes said, "but I intend to find out." She did not share her suspicions widely. The evacuation was already fragile, already stretched thin with grief and fear. She did not want to give people false hope, or worse, a reason to panic and refuse to leave a planet that might genuinely be in danger. But she asked Priya to keep digging, quietly, and she began keeping a private file of her own, filled with questions that had no answers yet. The final weeks of the evacuation were the hardest. Ships launched around the clock from every major spaceport on Earth. The Exodus fleet grew to over 4,000 vessels, carrying more than 3 billion people. It was not enough to save everyone. Many people, especially in poorer regions with fewer resources, could not be evacuated in time, and this fact haunted every person who worked on the fleet, including Reyes herself. Plans were made, promises given, that a second wave of ships would return for those left behind, but no one knew if there would be a second wave, or a system to return to. On the 89th day, the last ships lifted off from Earth's surface. Reyes stood in the observation deck of the Meridian, watching the blue and green planet grow smaller behind her, and she felt something break inside her chest that she suspected would never fully heal. Diego Santos, now serving as a junior engineer aboard one of the colony ships, watched Earth disappear from a small viewport near his bunk. He held the photograph of his grandmother's kitchen in his hand, and he did not cry, because he had promised himself he would not, but his hands shook anyway. Amara Chukwu gathered her students in the observation lounge of their ship and told them to look at Earth one last time, to remember its shape, its colors, the way the clouds moved across its surface. "We are not losing our home," she told them, though her voice cracked as she said it. "We are only leaving it for a while." The Exodus fleet moved outward, past Mars, past the asteroid belt, past Jupiter and its moons, gathering speed as it went. Behind them, Earth grew smaller and smaller, until it was only a pale blue dot among a field of stars. 3 days into the journey, as the fleet crossed the orbit of Neptune, preparing to make the jump to hyperspace, Priya Nair burst into the command deck of the Meridian, her face white as paper. "Admiral," she said, breathless, I found something. I found something in the Assembly's classified data logs. Someone leaked it. An old contact of mine on Assembly Station. A records clerk. He sent it to me an hour ago, and then his account went silent. Admiral, I don't think we should keep moving away from Earth." "Show me," Reyes said, and stood up from her chair. Priya pulled up the data on the main screen. It was a set of astronomical charts, star maps, and sensor readings, marked with symbols Reyes did not recognize at first. But as Priya began to explain what she had found, the blood drained from Reyes's face, and for the first time since the evacuation order arrived, she understood that the true danger to humanity was not the one they had been told about. It was far bigger than that, and it was coming. "Get me every ship commander in the fleet," Reyes said, her voice steady, despite the storm rising inside her. "We need to talk. And then, I think, we need to turn around." Behind her, on the main screen, the pale blue dot that was Earth had already vanished into the darkness of space. But for the first time in 89 days, Elena Reyes allowed herself to hope that they might see it again. The Exodus fleet had left Earth behind, following orders that made no sense, running from a danger no one could explain. But orders built on lies do not stay hidden forever, and secrets, once uncovered, have a way of pulling people back toward the truth. Somewhere in the darkness ahead, 4,000 ships, carrying the last of humanity, slowed their engines, one by one, as the order to change course spread through the fleet. And somewhere behind them, a small blue planet waited, unaware that its children were about to turn around and come home. The command deck of the Meridian, filled with the faces of ship commanders from across the Exodus fleet, projected in small windows across the main screen. 4,000 ships, and in this moment, every single one of them had stopped their engines and waited. Admiral Elena Reyes stood in front of the screen, Priya Nair beside her, the stolen data still glowing on the display behind them. 3 days ago, we left Earth because the Galactic Assembly told us to, Reyes began. They gave us no reason. They told us the reason was classified for our protection. We accepted that, because we did not have a choice, and because we hoped it was true. I am here to tell you that it was not true. Or at least, it was not the whole truth. She nodded to Priya, who brought up the star charts on the screen. This data was leaked to Lieutenant Nair by a records clerk working inside the Assembly's Central Archive, Reyes continued. It shows something the Assembly Council has known for over a year. Something they chose not to tell us. The star chart showed a wide section of the galaxy, far beyond the borders of Assembly space. At the edge of the chart, a strange shape moved slowly across the void, marked in red. It did not look like a fleet of ships. It looked more like a cloud, or a swarm, spreading outward in every direction as it moved. The Assembly calls this the hollow tide, Priya explained. It is not a species, not exactly. It is closer to a living weapon, or maybe an ancient machine intelligence, that consumes matter and energy on a massive scale. Stars, planets, entire systems. It has done this before, according to these records, twice in the last 300 years, in systems far from here. Both times, entire civilizations were wiped out before the Assembly could act. And it is coming this way, Reyes said quietly. The room went silent. On dozens of small screens, ship commanders stared back at her, their faces pale. According to this data, the hollow tide is currently 6 months from entering this sector of space, Priya continued. Assembly scientists have been tracking its path for over a year. They believe it is drawn toward areas of high energy output, inhabited systems, active industry, populated worlds. They cannot stop it. They have tried, in the past, with entire war fleets, and failed. All they can do is predict its path and try to redirect it, or slow it down. Redirect it how? Asked one of the ship commanders, a stern man named Captain Okonkwo, commanding one of the largest colony ships in the fleet. Priya hesitated before answering. By giving it something to consume that is not a populated system. Something big enough and bright enough to draw its attention and change its course. According to these notes, assembly scientists identified several possible systems that could serve this purpose, based on stellar composition and position relative to the hollow tide's current path. And Sol was one of them, Reyes finished. The silence that followed was heavier than before. They didn't order us to evacuate to protect us, said Captain Okonkwo slowly, understanding dawning on his face. They ordered us to evacuate, so they could use our sun as bait. That is what this data suggests, Reyes said. Sol's particular stellar composition, and its position at the edge of assembly space, makes it what these notes call an ideal diversion point. If the hollow tide consumes enough energy from our sun, it may change course away from the more populated, more powerful member worlds of the assembly. Worlds with older, more influential species. Worlds with more votes on the Assembly Council. They're sacrificing our home to save their own, someone said from one of the small screens, their voice tight with anger. That is what it looks like, Reyes said. And that is why they wanted the Sol system restricted and empty, not to protect us from the hollow tide's danger, to make sure no one interfered with their plan, and no one witnessed what they intended to let happen to our sun. For a long moment, nobody spoke. On the observation deck of the Meridian, and on every ship throughout the fleet, 3 billion people who had left everything behind, who had said goodbye to their homes and their old lives, absorbed the knowledge that their sacrifice had not been to save Earth. It had been to save someone else, without their permission, without even their knowledge. Diego Santos heard the news along with the rest of the crew on his ship, gathered around a common room screen, as Reyes's message was broadcast fleet-wide. An hour after the initial ship commander's meeting, he felt something hot and sharp rise in his chest, something he had not felt since the day he left his grandmother's kitchen for the last time. They used us, he said to the engineer standing next to him, an older woman named Fatima who had spent 30 years working in Earth's orbital shipyards. They used our whole planet as a shield. Fatima's jaw was tight. Question is, what do we do about it now? Across the fleet, that same question echoed in 1,000 different rooms. Anger spread quickly, but so did fear. If the hollow tide truly was coming toward Sol, then returning to Earth might mean returning to a system that would soon be destroyed. Some argued that whatever the Assembly's true motives, evacuation might still be the wisest choice. Others argued that if Earth was going to be sacrificed either way, humanity at least deserved to know, and deserved a say in the matter. Reyes called for a fleet-wide vote, something that had never been done before in the history of Earth's space program. Every ship, every colony vessel, every family aboard the Exodus fleet was given the chance to weigh in through a secure communication network, answering a single question: should the fleet continue away from Sol as ordered, or turn around and return to Earth to face the Assembly and demand answers? The vote took 2 days to complete. Reyes spent those 2 days barely sleeping, reviewing tactical data with her senior staff, trying to understand what options existed if the fleet did decide to turn back. She was not naive. She knew that even if the fleet returned to Sol, they would face the wrath of the Assembly Council, and possibly the hollow tide itself. She knew that any decision made now would shape the fate of humanity for generations. On the third day, the results came in. 78% of the fleet's population voted to turn around and return to Earth. Reyes was not surprised. She had expected as much. Humanity had left everything behind once, following orders they did not understand, trusting the words of strangers who had turned out to be lying. They were not willing to do it again. Set a course back to Sol, she told her helm officer. Full fleet formation. We're going home. The Exodus fleet turned. It was not a simple maneuver. 4,000 ships, of every size and design, had to coordinate a massive change of direction, without colliding, without losing formation, without leaving stragglers behind in the dark reaches of space. It took nearly 6 hours to complete the turn, and throughout those 6 hours, people across the fleet gathered at viewports and observation decks, watching the stars shift slowly around them as their ships came about, one by one, and pointed their bows back toward the pale blue star that was their sun. Amara Chukwu, gathered her students again, this time not to say goodbye to Earth, but to watch the fleet turn back toward it. "I told you we were only leaving for a while," she said, and this time, when she smiled, it did not feel like a lie. The journey back to Seoul took 3 weeks. During that time, Reyes worked with her senior engineers, including a young man whose name kept coming up in reports from one of the mid-sized colony ships, Diego Santos, the engineer who had left his grandmother's photograph as the only thing he took from Earth. Diego had spent the outbound journey studying the propulsion systems of the fleet's ships, and during the long weeks of the return trip, he began proposing modifications that could increase the fleet's overall speed and maneuverability by combining power systems from several older cargo vessels that were no longer needed for evacuation purposes, now that the fleet was heading home rather than away. Reyes noticed his work through a routine engineering report and requested he be transferred to her flagship to help oversee fleet-wide modifications. It was the beginning of what would become one of the most important partnerships of the coming months, though neither of them knew it yet. As the fleet approached the outer edge of the Sol system, 3 weeks after turning around, sensors detected a new set of contacts ahead. Ships, moving in a defensive formation, positioned directly in the fleet's path. "Assembly enforcement vessels," reported the Meridian sensor officer. "6 of them, heavy cruiser class. They are hailing us, Admiral." Reyes straightened in her command chair. This was the moment she had been preparing for since the fleet turned around. The moment humanity would face the assembly directly and demand the truth, out loud, where everyone could hear it. "Put them through," she said. The screen flickered, and the face of an assembly enforcement commander appeared, a tall, thin being, with pale gray skin and deep-set eyes, wearing the formal uniform of the Assembly's peacekeeping division. His expression was calm, controlled, but there was something uneasy beneath the surface, something that told Reyes he already knew why the human fleet had returned. "Human vessels," the commander said, his translated voice flat and even. "You are in violation of a direct evacuation order. The Sol system is restricted. You are ordered to reverse course immediately and resume your evacuation trajectory." Reyes stood up from her chair, squaring her shoulders, and looked directly into the camera. "My name is Admiral Elena Reyes, commanding officer of the Human Exodus Fleet," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the open channel, a channel she had made sure was being broadcast not only to the assembly enforcement ships, but to every human ship in the fleet, and recorded for release to every assembly member world that would listen. "We left our home because you told us to. We did not ask why, because we trusted that you had our best interests in mind. We were wrong to trust that. We know now why you truly wanted us gone." The assembly commander's expression flickered, just slightly. "I do not know what you are referring to." "The hollow tide," Reyes said. "We know it is coming. We know you intended to use our sun as a diversion, to protect other worlds at the cost of our own, without ever telling us the truth. We are not turning back. We are not resuming our evacuation. We have come home, and before we do anything else, we intend to ask the Assembly Council one question, and we intend to ask it in front of every member world, so that no one can pretend afterward that they did not hear it." "And what question is that?" the commander asked, his voice tight. Reyes held his gaze through the screen, and behind her, across 4,000 ships and 3 billion people, humanity waited to hear her ask the question that would define the next chapter of their history. "If our world is worth sacrificing to save yours," Reyes said, "then why were you never willing to ask us first?" The channel went silent. The assembly commander said nothing for a long moment, and then, slowly, the 6 enforcement cruisers began to move aside, opening a path through the outer edge of the Sol system, toward the pale blue star that was humanity's home. "The Council will hear your question, Admiral," the commander said finally. "I suggest you prepare your people. What comes next will not be simple." The path was clear. The Exodus fleet moved forward, past the silent enforcement cruisers, back into the system they had left 3 weeks earlier, back toward Earth, and toward whatever answer, or lack of one, awaited them there. Behind the fleet, far beyond the edge of assembly space, the hollow tide continued its slow, silent advance, 6 months away and closing, unaware and uncaring that an entire species had just decided it would rather face an ancient, unstoppable horror on its own terms than accept a lie in exchange for a quiet, hidden sacrifice. Elena Reyes sat back down in her command chair, watching Earth grow larger on the main screen as the fleet approached, and for the first time since the evacuation order arrived, she felt something steady settle into place inside her chest. Fear was still there, so was grief, and anger, and uncertainty about everything still to come. But beneath all of it was something else, something that felt, for the first time in months, like the beginning of hope. The Galactic Assembly Council met in a vast circular chamber on Concord Station, a massive artificial world built at the crossroads of a dozen trade routes, home to representatives from every member species. It was, by tradition and design, a place of order and calm debate. It had never, in the 200 years of its existence, hosted a session quite like the one that took place 3 days after the human fleet reached Earth. Marcus Webb stood at the human delegation's podium, a small raised platform near the edge of the vast chamber, feeling the weight of every eye in the room. Around him, representatives of 43 member species sat in tiered seating that spiraled upward toward a domed ceiling of transparent material, through which the stars of open space were visible. Some of these representatives were tall and thin, like the Assembly Enforcement Commander who had met the human fleet at the edge of Sol. Others were squat and broad, or nearly formless, communicating through devices that translated pulses of light into speech. Humanity was, as always, one of the newest and smallest voices in the room. But today, for the first time, every other voice had gone quiet to listen. The human delegation has requested this emergency session to present evidence regarding the evacuation order issued to the Sol system, said the Speaker of the Council, an elderly being from a species called the Vantel, known across the Assembly for their long lifespans and careful, deliberate speech. Ambassador Webb, you may proceed. Webb activated the display at his podium, and the star chart that Priya Nair had uncovered 3 weeks earlier appeared on the great central screen above the chamber floor, visible to every representative in the room. 2 months ago, the Assembly ordered humanity to evacuate our home system within 90 days, Webb began. We were told the reason was classified for our protection. We complied, because we are a young member of this Assembly, and we believed that older, wiser species would not ask this of us without good reason. We left our homes. We said goodbye to everything we had built, and then, through a data leak from within this very station, we learned the truth. He paused, letting the silence stretch across the chamber. We learned about the hollow tide, Webb continued. We learned that it is advancing through this sector, and that Assembly scientists identified our sun as a potential diversion point, a way to redirect this threat away from more established, more powerful member worlds, at the cost of our own system. We were never told this. We were never asked. We were simply ordered to leave so that our home could be quietly sacrificed without our knowledge or consent. A murmur rippled through the chamber, spreading outward through species after species, as translation devices caught up with Webb's words. This is a serious accusation, the speaker said carefully. Do you have proof of these claims? Webb nodded, and behind him, on the main screen, Priya's leaked data appeared in full. Star charts, sensor logs, internal Assembly communications, discussing the Sol system's suitability as what the documents openly called a diversion point. The chamber fell into a heavier silence, as representative after representative studied the evidence displayed before them. Some species reacted with visible anger, flashing colors, sharp gestures, raised voices in a dozen different languages. Others remained still and unreadable, their true reactions hidden behind unfamiliar faces and customs. A representative from a species called the Threll, tall beings with silver-scaled skin who had long been allies of the older, more powerful Assembly members, rose from their seat near the top of the chamber. Even if this data is accurate, the Threll representative said, the Assembly Council's decisions are made with the survival of the greatest number of member species in mind. Difficult choices are sometimes necessary. The human system was selected because of specific stellar properties that made it uniquely suited to this purpose. This is not malice. This is strategy, in the face of an unstoppable threat. Strategy that required lying to an entire species about their own extinction, Webb replied sharply. Strategy that required us to abandon our home without ever having the chance to say no, or to prepare, or to fight for a say in our own fate. If the Assembly believes this decision was justified, Then I asked the council directly, why was it never presented to us as a choice? The chamber was silent again. The Threll representative did not answer. It was the speaker who finally spoke, her voice heavy with something that sounded almost like regret. The council believed, perhaps wrongly, that presenting this choice openly would create panic, delay, and potential conflict that could endanger the timeline needed to prepare a response to the hollow tide. It was decided that a controlled evacuation, without full disclosure, was the safest path for all parties involved. Safest for all parties except us, Webb said. You decided that our home was an acceptable cost, and you decided this without ever giving us the chance to argue otherwise. That is what my people have returned to challenge, not the danger of the hollow tide, not the necessity of difficult choices, but the fact that this choice was made for us, instead of with us. For a long moment, no one in the chamber spoke. Then, from a section of seating near the middle tiers, a new voice rose, smaller, quieter, but clear. It belonged to a representative from a species called the Koran, small, furred beings who had joined the assembly only a decade before humanity, and who were known throughout the council for having little political influence and even less say in major decisions. The human ambassador raises a fair question, the Koran representative said. My own people were nearly relocated from our homeworld 8 years ago, for reasons the council described as necessary for regional stability. We were never told the full truth of that decision either, until years later, when it no longer mattered. I have often wondered what might have happened if we had been given the chance to argue for ourselves, as the humans are doing today. More voices rose after that, not all in support of the human position, but enough to shift the tone of the chamber from unified authority to genuine, uncertain debate. Species after species began questioning not just the decision made about soul, but the pattern of decisions made by the council over the decades. Decisions made quietly, on behalf of smaller, newer, or less influential members, without their full knowledge or consent. The speaker allowed the debate to continue for nearly 2 hours before finally raising a hand for silence. The human delegation came here today not simply to accuse this council of wrongdoing, she said, but I believe, to ask a specific question. Ambassador Webb, I believe it is time you asked it directly. Webb straightened, feeling the eyes of the entire chamber settle on him once more. He thought of Reyes, back aboard the Meridian, and of the 3 billion people who had turned an entire evacuation fleet around, rather than accept a comfortable lie. He thought of his own years spent building trust with the assembly, trust that had just been broken, and that he now had to decide whether it could be rebuilt. My question is simple, Webb said. If our world was truly necessary as a shield to protect the wider assembly from the hollow tide, then we ask this council to prove it to us honestly, and to ask us properly, as partners, rather than deciding it for us in secret. We do not refuse to help protect other worlds. We refuse to be sacrificed without a voice in our own fate. So I ask you now, in front of every member species gathered here, will the assembly finally tell us the full truth about the threat we face, and will you allow humanity to decide, for ourselves, how we choose to respond to it? The speaker was quiet for a long moment, and then she inclined her head. A gesture Webb had learned, over many years, indicated respect among the Vantel. You will have your answer, she said, but it is not mine alone to give. Bring forward the full data on the hollow tide's current trajectory, and the projected models of Sol's potential effect on its course. A new set of images appeared on the great screen, updated star charts, more detailed than the ones Priya had leaked weeks earlier. The hollow tide's projected path was shown as a wide, spreading cone of red, moving steadily through the sector. Sol sat near the outer edge of that cone, close enough to be affected, but not, Webb now saw, directly in its center. The truth, the speaker said, is more complicated than either the council's original silence or your fleet's accusations suggest. Sol was identified as one possible diversion point, yes, but it was never the only option, nor even the most effective one. There is a second candidate system, uninhabited, 3 light-years from Sol, that assembly scientists believe could serve the same purpose with slightly less certainty, but without requiring the displacement of an inhabited world. The council chose the human system regardless, because the models showed a marginally higher chance of success, and because, she paused, and for the first time, her composed voice wavered slightly, because humanity, as a new and small member of this assembly, was judged to have less political cost attached to the decision than would have been the case with an older, more established member world. The chamber went utterly silent. "You sacrificed us," Webb said slowly, "not because we were the only option, but because we were the easiest one." "Yes," the speaker admitted, "and I believe, hearing your fleet's answer today, that this council owes your species a genuine apology, and a genuine choice, which we should have offered from the beginning." It was not the answer Webb had expected, not a flat denial, not a stubborn defense of the original decision, but something rarer and more difficult, an admission of fault, spoken aloud, in front of every member species of the Assembly. "Then give us the choice now," Webb said. "Let humanity decide how we respond to the hollow tide, with full knowledge of what is at stake, and full say in what happens to our home." The speaker nodded slowly. "The council will convene to discuss the matter formally, but I will say this much today, so that it is heard by every species present. The human fleet's decision to turn back, to demand answers rather than accept a quiet sacrifice, has forced this council to confront a truth we have avoided for a long time, that our habit of making difficult choices on behalf of our smaller, newer members, without their voice, is not strategy. It is a failure of the values this assembly was built upon. Whatever humanity chooses to do next, this council will support their right to choose it." The session ended shortly after, with no final resolution, no clear plan for what would happen next. But something had shifted in that chamber, something that would ripple outward across dozens of member worlds in the days that followed. Word of the human fleet's defiance, and of Webb's question, spread quickly through assembly space, carried by traders, diplomats, and news networks, eager to cover the first open challenge to council authority, in living memory. Aboard the Meridian, Reyes received word of the council session through a direct transmission from Webb, several hours after it ended. She read his report twice, standing alone on the observation deck, watching Earth turn slowly below the fleet, now gathered in high orbit around the planet they had so nearly left behind for good. The hollow tide was still coming. That much had not changed. 6 months, now closer to 5, before it would reach the edge of the sector. Sol remained one of 2 possible diversion points, and nothing about the physics of the threat itself had softened in the telling. But for the first time, humanity had been given a choice in the matter, and Elena Reyes intended to make sure that whatever choice they made, it would be one they made for themselves, together, with open eyes and full knowledge of the cost. She turned from the window and called her senior staff to the command deck. There was a great deal of work still to be done, and now, at last, humanity would decide for itself how the story of the hollow tide would end. 5 months. That was how long humanity had before the hollow tide reached the edge of the Sol system, assuming its current path did not change. 5 months to decide and prepare for whatever came next. The debate that followed Webb's confrontation with the Assembly Council was, in some ways, harder than the one that had led the fleet to turn around in the first place. This time, there was no lie to expose, no simple villain to blame. There was only a terrible, honest choice: move a second candidate system into position as an alternative diversion point, and hope it worked as well as the models predicted, or stay, defend Sol with everything humanity had, and risk losing everything if the defense failed. Admiral Reyes called for another fleet-wide vote, but before the vote was held, she insisted on something the Assembly Council had never offered humanity in the first place: full transparency. Every scrap of data on the hollow tide, every model, every uncertainty, was released publicly, translated into every human language, broadcast to every ship in the fleet, and every remaining community on Earth's surface. Diego Santos spent long nights in the Meridian's engineering bay studying the data alongside assembly scientists who had, remarkably, volunteered to assist humanity directly, following the Council's public admission of fault. One of these scientists, a Corin researcher named Vesh, became a frequent presence in Diego's workspace, the two of them poring over models of the hollow tide's structure and behavior late into the ship's night cycle. "It is not truly alive, not in the way you understand life," Vesh explained one evening, projecting a rotating model of the hollow tide above the engineering console. "It is closer to an ancient, self-replicating machine intelligence, though its true origin is unknown, even to the oldest assembly records. It consumes matter and converts it into more of itself. growing larger and more numerous as it moves. It does not think, or plan, in any way we recognize. It simply follows patterns of energy, drawn toward the brightest and most active sources it detects. So if we don't give it something to be drawn toward, Diego said slowly, it just keeps coming straight for us. Yes, Vesh said. Unless it is redirected, or unless it can somehow be stopped or destroyed, which no civilization has yet managed to do. Diego stared at the rotating model for a long time. Slowly, an idea began to take shape in his mind, not a way to defeat the Holotide outright, but perhaps a way to survive its passage without sacrificing soul at all. What if we didn't try to redirect it toward a whole other star system, he said. What if we gave it something smaller, closer, and controlled it more precisely? A concentrated burst of energy, positioned exactly where we want it, timed exactly when we want it, instead of hoping a whole star 3 light-years away pulls its attention the right direction from this far out. Vesh's ears flattened in surprise. An expression Diego had learned, over the past weeks, indicated deep interest among the Koran. You are suggesting we build our own diversion, rather than relying on an existing star system. Exactly, Diego said, energy building in his voice now. Something we control completely. Something positioned precisely enough to redirect the Holotide's path away from Sol, without needing an entire second habitable system to serve as bait. Over the following weeks, Diego's idea grew into a full engineering proposal, developed alongside Vesh and a growing team of both human and assembly scientists drawn to the challenge. The plan was bold: construct a massive artificial energy source, built from decommissioned ships and salvaged colony vessel reactors, positioned at a precise point along the Holotide's projected path, far enough from Sol to redirect its course, but close enough to be built and maintained using resources already available to the fleet. It would not be easy. It would require nearly every spare ship in the Exodus fleet to be stripped down for parts, an enormous undertaking that would leave humanity with almost no ships left over for a backup evacuation, should the plan fail. It would require months of careful construction, timed perfectly to be ready before the Holotide's arrival. And even if it worked exactly as planned, there was no guarantee the massive artificial construct, soon nicknamed the Beacon by the engineers building it, would be bright and powerful enough to draw the Holotide's attention away from the much larger, much brighter light of Earth's own sun. Reyes presented the plan to the fleet in a broadcast that reached every remaining human, whether aboard ship or on Earth's surface, 3 weeks after Diego first proposed the idea to Vesh. This is not a guaranteed solution, she told them plainly, refusing to soften the truth the way the Assembly Council once had. It may fail. If it fails, we will have very little time, and very few resources, to attempt a second evacuation. But if it succeeds, we save our home, without ever asking another world to bear a cost we were unwilling to bear ourselves. I believe this is worth attempting, but this choice belongs to all of us, together. The vote that followed was different from the one 3 months earlier. That vote had been driven by anger and a refusal to be lied to. This vote was driven by something else, a hope, however fragile, that humanity might find a way to save its home through its own effort and ingenuity, rather than accepting either a quiet sacrifice or a desperate flight into the unknown. 91% of the fleet and of the remaining population on Earth voted to proceed with the Beacon project. Construction began immediately. Every shipyard, every engineering team, every spare hand across the fleet was put to work. Ships that had once carried families away from Earth in grief were now stripped down, piece by piece, their reactors and hulls repurposed into the growing structure of the Beacon, assembled at a carefully calculated point along the Holotide's projected path. Amara Chukwu's students, now teenagers who had spent nearly half a year living aboard the fleet, volunteered for work crews alongside the adults, learning welding and reactor maintenance in makeshift training programs set up throughout the fleet. Fatima, the veteran shipyard engineer who had worked alongside Diego since the earliest days of the return journey, took charge of an entire construction team, working alongside assembly volunteers from a dozen different species who had traveled to Sol specifically to help with the project, moved by the story of humanity's defiance and determination. Not every assembly member supported the effort. Some, particularly among the older, more established species, viewed the Beacon project with skepticism, believing it was doomed to fail, or worse, that it represented a dangerous precedent, a smaller, newer species refusing the Council's guidance and attempting a solution far beyond its proven capabilities. The Threll representative who had defended the Council's original decision continued, in assembly sessions, to argue against providing further support to what he called an unproven and reckless human gamble. But others disagreed. The Corin delegation, moved by their own history of being relocated without consent, became one of humanity's strongest advocates within the Council, providing not only Vesh's ongoing engineering assistance, but also material support in the form of spare ship components and skilled technicians. Several smaller, newer assembly member species, watching humanity's story unfold, began to see something of themselves in it. The fear of being treated as expendable by older, more powerful members of a community they had only recently joined. Slowly, month by month, the beacon took shape. It grew from a rough skeleton of salvaged hulls into a massive, glowing structure larger than any single ship in the fleet, its internal reactors calibrated with painstaking precision by Diego, Vesh, and a growing team of engineers who barely slept as the deadline approached. Reyes, meanwhile, faced a different kind of pressure. As construction of the beacon consumed more and more of the fleet's ships, the option of a second evacuation, should the plan fail, grew less and less realistic. She held daily briefings with her senior staff, constantly weighing the risks, constantly searching for contingency plans that might save at least some portion of humanity if the beacon failed to redirect the hollow tide in time. "We need a fallback," she told Diego and Vesh, 2 months before the hollow tide's projected arrival. "If the beacon does not work, what happens next? What happens to Earth, and to everyone who cannot escape in time?" Diego and Vesh exchanged a long look, and then Vesh spoke carefully. "There may be a second option, though it is far less certain than the beacon itself. If the beacon's redirection is only partial, rather than complete, it may still be possible to shield Sol's inner system using a coordinated defensive formation of the fleet's remaining warships, absorbing and dispersing a portion of the hollow tide's leading edge before it reaches the inhabited worlds. It would not stop the hollow tide, but it might buy enough time for a partial evacuation, if the worst outcome comes to pass. That would mean putting warships directly in its path," Reyes said slowly. "Crude warships." "Yes," Vesh admitted. "It is not a plan I offer lightly, Admiral. But it may be the only fallback available to you, if the beacon does not succeed as fully as we hope." Reyes was quiet for a long moment, staring at the model of the hollow tide slowly rotating on the console before her, the same model Diego had studied months earlier, when the idea for the beacon first took shape. She thought of the 9 billion people who had once called Earth home, the 3 billion who remained aboard the fleet, and the countless more still living on Earth's surface, waiting to learn whether their home would survive the coming months. "Then we prepare both," she said finally, "the beacon and the fleet formation as a fallback. We do not put all our hope into a single plan, not after everything this fleet has already survived." Over the following weeks, as the beacon neared completion, Reyes quietly began organizing a defensive formation of the fleet's remaining warships, training crews for a scenario she prayed would never be necessary. Diego, exhausted from months of work on the beacon, found himself increasingly drawn into these preparations as well, his engineering expertise proving valuable in calculating how the fleet's ships might best coordinate their formation to absorb and disperse the hollow tide's leading edge, should it come to that. 4 months after the Assembly Council's admission of fault, 5 months after the human fleet first turned back toward Earth, the beacon was declared complete. It hung in space at its calculated position, a massive, glowing structure of salvaged hulls and repurposed reactors, humanity's answer to a threat that had once seemed impossible to face on their own terms. 1 month remained before the hollow tide's projected arrival. Reyes stood once more on the observation deck of the Meridian, watching Earth turn slowly below the fleet, its cities lit against the darkness of night, its oceans catching the last light of a setting sun. Somewhere far beyond the edge of the system, the hollow tide continued its slow, silent advance, drawing ever closer, indifferent to the months of desperate effort humanity had poured into the hope of surviving its passage. Behind her, the fleet gathered in its final defensive positions, warships arrayed alongside the glowing beacon, crews standing ready for whatever the final month would bring. Diego and Vesh made their final calculations. Amara's students, now trained and hardened by months of preparation, took their places among the crews. Fatima oversaw the last repairs to the beacon's outer hull. And across Earth, and across the fleet, 3 billion people who had once left their home under a lie, and had turned back to demand the truth, now waited together to see whether their own hands, and their own choice, could save the world they had refused to abandon. The final month had begun. The hollow tide arrived 4 days early. No one had expected the error. Assembly scientists had tracked its movement for over a year, refining their models again and again, but the hollow tide did not move like a fleet of ships, following predictable paths through open space. It moved like weather, like a slow, spreading storm, and storms do not always arrive on schedule. The first warning came from a sensor buoy stationed at the outer edge of the Sol system, one of dozens placed there months earlier to give the fleet advance notice of the hollow tide's approach. The buoy's signal cut out at 0347 fleet time, and 30 seconds later, a second buoy, closer to the beacon's position, began transmitting readings that made the sensor officer aboard the Meridian go pale and reach immediately for the ship-wide alert. Admiral Reyes was in her quarters, catching the first real sleep she had allowed herself in nearly a week, when the alert woke her. She was on the command deck within 4 minutes, still pulling her uniform jacket into place as she read the incoming data. "It's here," she said, and the words felt strange in her mouth, after 5 months of waiting. The hollow tide did not look like anything humanity had imagined, despite months of studying models and simulations. It appeared on the Meridian's long-range sensors as a vast, shifting field of energy signatures, spreading across a region of space, larger than the entire orbit of Jupiter, moving inward toward the beacon, and, beyond it, toward Sol itself. It was not a single object. It was closer to a living cloud of countless small, semi-intelligent fragments, each one drawn toward energy, each one capable of tearing apart matter and converting it into more of itself. "Beacon status," Reyes said sharply. "Fully powered, Admiral," came the reply from the beacon's command station, staffed by a joint team of Diego's engineers and assembly volunteers. Diego Santos reports all reactor arrays at maximum output. The beacon is broadcasting at full intensity across all frequencies the hollow tide has been observed to respond to. And the fleet formation? Warships moving into position now, Admiral. Estimated 11 minutes to full defensive alignment. 11 minutes. Reyes did the math in her head. The leading edge of the hollow tide, based on its current speed, would reach the beacon's position in approximately 8 minutes. The fleet would not be fully in position in time. "Signal all ships," she said. "Move to defensive alignment at maximum speed. We do not wait for perfect formation. We take whatever position we can hold when the tide arrives." Aboard the beacon, Diego Santos stood at the central control console, watching the same sensor data scroll across his own screens, his hands steady, despite the cold knot of fear in his stomach. Vesh stood beside him, along with a dozen other engineers, human and assembly alike, all of them having volunteered to remain aboard the beacon through its first critical test, rather than evacuate to the safety of the fleet's rear formation. "Reactor output holding steady," Vesh reported, ears pressed flat against his skull, a sign of tension Diego had come to recognize well over the past months. "If the models are correct, the hollow tide should begin registering our signature within the next 90 seconds, and begin adjusting course shortly after." "And if the models are wrong?" asked one of the younger engineers, a woman named Sophia, who had joined the project only 2 months earlier, fresh out of the fleet's emergency engineering academy. Diego did not answer right away. He had asked himself the same question more times than he could count over the long months of construction. If the models were wrong, if the beacon was not bright enough, not precisely positioned enough, not powerful enough to draw the hollow tide's attention away from Sol, then everyone aboard the beacon, and everyone in the fleet's forward formation, would be directly in its path, with nothing standing between them and total destruction. "Then we find out very quickly," Diego said finally, "and we do everything we can with the time we have left." The leading edge of the hollow tide crossed into visual range 6 minutes later, a shimmering, churning wall of light and shadow that stretched across the entire forward horizon of the fleet's sensors, growing larger and closer with every passing second. Reyes watched it from the Meridian's command deck, her hands gripping the edge of her chair, and around her, the bridge crew worked in tense, focused silence, monitoring every ship in the fleet's rapidly forming defensive line. Beacon signature confirmed at full output, the sensor officer reported. Hollow tide leading edge showing a change in trajectory, Admiral. Small but measurable. It's curving. Reyes felt her breath catch. Toward the beacon? Confirmed, Admiral. The beacon is drawing it. Angle of deflection currently at 4 degrees and increasing. A murmur of hope rippled across the command deck, quickly silenced, as everyone returned their attention to their stations. 4 degrees was not enough. The models had calculated that a deflection of at least 12 degrees would be needed to redirect the bulk of the hollow tide safely away from Sol, and even a partial success, anything less than full deflection, would still send a significant portion of the tide's mass directly into the fleet's defensive formation. Aboard the beacon, Diego watched the deflection angle climb slowly on his own console. 4 degrees, 5, 6. The numbers rising with agonizing slowness as the hollow tide's leading edge drew closer. "It's working," Sophia said, disbelief and hope mixing in her voice. "It's actually working." "It's not enough yet," Vesh said sharply, cutting off the celebration before it could fully begin. "At current deflection rate, we will reach only 9 degrees by the time the tide's main mass arrives. That will not be sufficient." Diego's mind raced. 9 degrees would leave Sol partially exposed and would leave the fleet's defensive formation directly in the path of a significant portion of the hollow tide's mass. He looked at the reactor output readings, searching for any margin left unused, any way to push the beacon's signature higher. "Vesh," he said suddenly, "the secondary reactors, the ones we kept in reserve as a safety margin, in case of equipment failure. What's our current risk if we bring them online now, at full power, alongside the primary array?" Vesh's ears flattened further. "Diego, those reactors were never tested at combined full output with the primary array. There is a significant risk of feedback overload. It could destroy the beacon's core structure. And if we don't do it, then we very likely fail to achieve sufficient deflection, and the fleet takes the impact instead." Diego looked around the control room, at Sophia, at the other engineers, at Vesh, all of them watching him, waiting for a decision that would decide the fate of the entire construction, and possibly the entire defensive fleet stationed just behind it. "Do it," he said. "Bring the secondary reactors online. Full power, right now." Vesh hesitated only a moment before his hands moved across the console, initiating the sequence. Across the beacon's massive structure, dormant reactors that had sat unused throughout months of construction roared to life, their output feeding into the same broadcasting array as the primary system, pushing the beacon's total energy signature far beyond anything the original models had calculated. The structure shuddered. Alarms began sounding across half the control room stations, warning of stress fractures forming in the outer hull, of temperature spikes in the secondary reactor housings, of a dozen different systems straining under a load they had never been designed to handle. But on the main display, the deflection angle began climbing faster. 7 degrees, 8, 9, 10. 11 degrees, Vesh called out, his voice tight over the sound of the alarms. 11.5. "Diego, the hull integrity readings, we cannot sustain this much longer." "Just a little more," Diego said, watching the numbers climb, willing them upward with everything he had. Come on. 12 degrees. The deflection angle crossed the threshold the models had called for, and held there, steady, as the leading edge of the hollow tide swept past the beacon's position, curving away from its original path, away from Sol, drawn instead toward the massive, blazing signature. The beacon continued to broadcast, even as its outer hull began to buckle under the strain. "It's turning," the sensor officer aboard the Meridian reported, disbelief plain in her voice. "Admiral, the hollow tide's main mass is turning. It's following the beacon." Reyes stared at the display, watching the vast, shimmering cloud of the hollow tide bend its course, slowly but unmistakably, away from the fleet's defensive formation, away from the pale blue dot of Earth still visible far behind them, and toward the glowing, straining structure of the beacon itself. "Casualties aboard the beacon?" she asked immediately, her relief tempered by a rising fear for the crew, who had stayed behind to keep it running. "Beacon reports critical structural failures beginning in the outer sections," came the reply. "Evacuation pods have been launched from all non-essential stations. Command crew reports they are remaining at their posts to maintain output until full deflection is confirmed." Get them out of there, Reyes said sharply. The moment deflection is confirmed complete, I want every remaining soul off that structure. Aboard the beacon, Diego felt the deck shudder beneath his feet as another section of the outer hull tore away, venting atmosphere into the vacuum of space. Around him, warning lights flashed red across every console, and the temperature in the control room had risen enough that sweat ran freely down his face despite the ship's failing environmental controls. Deflection holding at 12.3 degrees. Vesh reported, his voice strained but steady. Diego, the Holotide's main mass, has fully committed to its new trajectory. It is moving away from Sol. It is moving toward us. Then it's working, Diego said, a strange, exhausted relief cutting through the fear in his chest. Everyone, evacuation pods, now. Vesh, you too. The reactors need to remain active until the Holotide's mass has fully passed our position, Vesh said. If we shut down now, there is a risk the deflection will not hold, and a portion of the mass could still redirect back toward Sol. Diego looked at the timer on his console, counting down the estimated minutes until the Holotide's main mass would fully pass the beacon's position and continue on its new, harmless trajectory into empty space. 6 minutes. The beacon's hull integrity readings showed critical failure was likely within the next 2. Then someone has to stay, Diego said quietly, to keep the reactors running until it's clear. Diego. I designed this system, Vesh. I know it better than anyone else aboard. Get everyone else to the pods. That's an order, or as close to one as I can give you. Vesh stared at him for a long moment, something unreadable passing across his alien features. Then, without another word, he began ushering Sophia and the remaining engineers toward the evacuation pods, moving quickly through the shuddering, failing corridors of the beacon's control section. Diego turned back to his console, alone now except for the sound of alarms and the distant groan of failing structural supports, and kept his hands steady on the controls, watching the deflection angle hold, watching the great, shimmering mass of the Holotide sweep past the beacon's position, drawn ever further from Sol, from Earth, from everyone who had placed their trust in a plan built from salvaged ships and desperate hope. 4 minutes. 3. 2. The beacon's main structural core began to fail in earnest, the deck tilting beneath him as entire sections of the outer hull sheared away. Diego held his position at the console, watching the timer count down, watching the last edge of the Holotide's mass finally clear the beacon's position, its trajectory locked, unmistakably, onto a course that led far from any inhabited world. Deflection complete, he said into the open comm channel, his voice hoarse. Full success. The tide is clear of Sol. He did not wait to hear the response. He was already moving, sprinting through the collapsing corridors toward the last remaining evacuation pod, the ship groaning and tearing itself apart around him. He reached the pod with seconds to spare, sealing the hatch just as a final structural failure tore through the section he had occupied moments before, and the pod launched into open space as what remained of the beacon began to break apart behind him. Aboard the Meridian, Reyes watched the sensor readings confirm what everyone had already begun to hope: the Holotide, fully deflected, moving away from Sol on a new trajectory that would carry it harmlessly through empty space for the foreseeable future. Around her, the command deck erupted into quiet, disbelieving celebration, officers embracing, some crying, all of them feeling 5 months of accumulated fear finally begin to lift. Beacon evacuation status, Reyes said, cutting through the celebration, still gripped by concern for the crew who had remained behind. All pods launched and recovered, Admiral, came the reply. Full crew accounted for. Diego Santos was the last aboard. He's aboard a recovery shuttle now. Minor injuries only. Reyes closed her eyes for a long moment, relief washing through her so completely that her hands shook slightly against the arms of her command chair. Then she opened them again and looked out at the main screen, at Earth, still turning slowly below the fleet, its cities still lit against the darkness of night, safe now, truly safe, for the first time in 5 months. The following weeks brought a flood of changes across both humanity and the wider assembly. News of the beacon's success spread quickly through assembly space, carried alongside the story of everything that had led to it: the lie, the fleet's defiant return, the Council's admission of fault, and finally, the desperate, brilliant solution humanity had built with its own hands: rather than accept the sacrifice originally planned for it. The Assembly Council convened a second emergency session, this time not to hear an accusation, but to formally recognize what humanity had accomplished. The beacon's design, refined and studied by Assembly scientists in the weeks following its success, was adopted as a new standard protocol for future encounters with the Hollow Tide, or similar threats, offering other member worlds a way to protect their systems, without requiring another species to bear the cost in silence. The Threll representative, who had argued most forcefully against the Council's original decision, offered a formal apology to the human delegation, the first such apology in the Assembly's recorded history. It was not enough, on its own, to undo everything that had happened, but it marked, for many across the Assembly, the beginning of a slow, difficult process of reform, one built on the understanding that no member species, however new or small, should ever again be treated as an acceptable, unspoken cost. Diego Santos recovered from his injuries within a few weeks, and was later honored, alongside Vesh and the rest of the beacon's engineering team, in a ceremony held in Earth's orbit, attended by representatives from dozens of Assembly worlds. He kept his grandmother's photograph on his desk throughout the ceremony, a small, quiet reminder of everything that had been at stake, and everything that had, against long odds, been saved. Amara Chukwu returned to Earth's surface with her students, now grown and changed by everything they had witnessed and endured, and resumed teaching in a rebuilt schoolhouse not far from where her old classroom had once stood. She told her students a new story now, about a bird that had left its nest, and had found a way to protect it from very far away, without ever truly leaving it behind. Admiral Elena Reyes stood once more on the observation deck of the Meridian, months after the Hollow Tide's deflection, watching Earth turn slowly below the fleet that had carried humanity away from its home, and then brought it back again. The Exodus fleet had not been fully disbanded. Some ships remained in orbit, a permanent reminder of everything humanity had survived, while others had returned to their original purposes, ferrying colonists and cargo across the growing reach of human space. Marcus Webb joined her on the observation deck, as he often did in the quiet hours between diplomatic sessions, watching the same view that had once carried the weight of an entire species' uncertain future. "They're calling it a turning point," Webb said. "Not just for us, for the whole Assembly. Smaller member worlds are starting to demand the same kind of transparency we fought for. The Corin have already filed a formal review of the decision made about their own relocation, years ago." "Good," Reyes said quietly. "No one should have to turn around and ask the question we asked, just to be treated like they matter." Webb was quiet for a moment, watching the pale blue and green curve of Earth below them, its oceans catching the light of a rising sun. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we hadn't turned around? If we'd just kept going, the way we were ordered to?" Reyes considered the question for a long moment before answering. "I think about it sometimes, but I don't wonder what would have happened to Earth. I already know. It would have burned, quietly, so that no one outside this system ever had to think about it again. What I wonder about is what would have happened to us, to who we are, as a people. I don't think we could have lived with that, even if we'd survived it." Below them, Earth continued its slow, steady turn, unaware and unbothered, as it had always been, by the vast and complicated struggles of the beings who called it home. But for everyone who had lived through the past year, who had left it behind under a lie, and returned to it by demanding the truth, the sight of that small blue world held a meaning it had never quite held before. They had been ordered to abandon it. They had turned around instead, and asked why. And in the asking, they had found not just an answer, but a reason to build something new, together, out of the wreckage of an old and broken silence. The fleet remained in orbit, watching over the world it had once nearly left forever, and far beyond the edge of the solar system, the Hollow Tide continued on its new path, harmless now, a quiet reminder of how close humanity had come to losing everything, and how much they had gained by refusing, in the end, to leave without an answer.